and welcome to the latest edition of the Shindig podcast about archaeology, brought to you by the Red River Archaeology Group. As ever, I'm your host, Dr. Tom Horn, and I'm joined also as ever by our ace producer, Luke Barry. Hi, Luke.
Hey guys, we're all right. How are things, Tom? You have a good one this week?
It's a very dear friend of mine, Tenaya. We were digging together at Repton, which maybe gives you a hint of the Tenaya's research interest. That is the Vikings, and she's done amazing work on mapping the Vikings, and she actually created an entirely open access project on mapping the Viking world. And we'll send you out all the links to that when we post about this. But just to give you some background on Tenaya, she's just finishing actually her PhD. She's based at the Trinity Centre for Environmental Humanities at UCD, and she's also currently a guest researcher at the University of Oslo. And her PhD title is Mapping the Viking World, a GIS, that's a graphical analysis of contemporary textual records and archaeological material related to the Vikings. So she's going to defend that in this spring. And we had her on today for three reasons. She's a friend of ours. And she also used to work for the Red River Archaeology Group. And she was actually our first podcaster along with Johnsky. And they created season 1. So we wouldn't be here without Tenaya and John. So any excuse to say thanks was important to us. Yeah. But Tenaya's research on Vikings is absolutely fascinating, and I'm just interested to look what you thought when I said, I'm going to talk to another one of my friends about the Vikings. What were you thinking? Oh no, self-indulgent.
Oh no.
Or are you thinking this is going to be
how much editing am I going to have to do, because this will go 6 or 7 hours? and I get the feeling if I let you go 6 or 7 hours, you would have went 6 or 7 hours.
Yeah. And I think that's what you'll see in this. I mean, I think I couldn't see Luke's face, but looking at Tenaya and I's eyes at one stage when we got really into the Vikings and really into Gotland and Dirhams and what's happening in the area of modern Denmark in the 850s, we got really into it. And if Luke had just stopped recording, we'd still be talking now. We wouldn't have noticed. It didn't matter at that stage. So hopefully you'll get as into it as Tenaya and I did, as we're talking about mapping the Vikings. We're talking about where they were going and when, and Tenaya's got some really fascinating theories about there being sort of two distinct groups of Vikings in a sort of a chronological sense in the main, but also geographically and where they're from in Scandinavia. So hopefully we've just finished recording it, and hopefully you'll have as much fun as Luke and I did, and here you are. Hi, Tenaya. Thank you so much for joining us today. As you know too well, I'm a big Vikingist too. But I think the thing I always like to ask people who study the Vikings, there's lots of obvious things you can be interested in, but what was the first thing you learned maybe as a kid or saw about the Vikings that made you think, actually, these guys have something about them that I want to spend far too much of my life studying?
Well, I am American, unfortunately, and my last name is Jorgensen, and so I grew up just hearing, "Oh, you're Norwegian, even though we're not, we're the 7th generation American Norwegian, and so it was just always kind of put into my head that we had this kind of background in it. And so in 2014, I went to Oslo and I was visiting, and I went to the Viking ship museum, and I walked in and I saw the Oseberg ship, and I had this out of body experience where I felt like I could hear the paddles and the waves, and I was like, oh my God, this is it for me. And I know that sounds really corny, but it was such an awe-inspiring moment. And then I've had just such an exciting career doing my master's between Iceland and Norway in the Viking Medieval North Studies program. And and it's just been amazing to study the Vikings in their homelands essentially, and experience that. Just kind of a kindred experience, I suppose. So being out in nature has always helped, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's because you're based in Oslo at the moment, aren't you? So you can sort of see. I think now they're rebuilding the Viking ship museum, aren't they?
They are, yeah. So it's closed right now, unfortunately, but it will be reopened in 2026, I think.
Fantastic. Well, I'll have to come and visit to see it then. But until then, or just before then, you've been studying for your PhD about mapping the Vikings. Now, I also think it's a good thing at the start of a pod, just because I'll forget, we'll just start talking about Vikings. But I think it'd be a good idea if you just gave us, I suppose this is what the podcast, hopefully people are listening to for that. But if you had to tell the listener, the sort of classic 2-minute elevator pitch, what your thesis is about, what would you say to them and to me now about that?
My PhD is called Mapping the Viking Age, a GIS analysis of the contemporary evidence. And I did see in your notes that you selected contemporary evidence, but just had to shorten the title a little bit. But what I have done is I have collected the contemporary historical records, being for the sake of the project, just being annals and chronicles. So the Frankish annals, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, and the Irish annals. And then I have taken archaeological materials relating to coin and silver hoards, as well as burials and female jewelry that has been identified in England in the portable antiquities scheme. And so I have mapped all of that against each other. So with the historical records, if they say they attacked Paris, then I will take that entry, geocoordinate it. And so then when you map it against each other, you can kind of see where they've been, where the historical sources match up with the archaeological sources, and where they don't. And my biggest frustration within Viking studies is that you tend to get very niche scholarly reports of the Vikings in England or the Vikings in Ireland, when most scholars will be very quick to say the Vikings did not see borders, they did not care about borders, they were just doing their own thing and moving between all these places. So by taking all of this evidence and mapping them against each other, I was able to get this really kind of bird's eye view, holistic understanding of the geographical distribution of how and when they went about all these things between 790 to 920.
So, what then, we've the elevator doors are opening, and I'm just trying to say, this is fascinating tonight, but before you go, what is your big takeaway? What is, drum roll, what can you tell us now? You may not want to reveal too much, but what's the sort of takeaway from all your many years of research into mapping the Vikings?
So I'm going to say, I'm happy to tell anybody what I've learned. The thing about the map is I actually have made it like open access. So if you attach the website, people can go and they can play around and click on different points and stuff. And I want that. I want it to be accessible. I'm not a big fan of academia and the ivory tower type thing. So, but what my big understanding is that it's all politics. I believe that I think we all have this idea that the Viking Age started in 793 with the attack on Lindisfarne, but that's such an English narrative. Sorry, no offense to our English listeners, but that's such an English narrative because what's happening is the Carolingian kingdom over in Frankia, which is now France and Germany and the Netherlands. Charlemagne was building this gigantic kingdom in the Carolingian Empire, and he was pushing north into Saxony, which is now northern Germany. And there was the Danish tribes in Jutland were looking south and looking at this empire moving toward them, and they were going, hard pass, no thank you. And they built this gigantic wall called the Dannevirke. And it is my opinion that in response to this massive Frankish army moving north that the Danish kingdom then kind of consolidated into what we would recognize as a centralized kingdom. And as you have this centralized kingdom forming in Denmark, you also have power ripples disrupting up into the north, into Norway. And Dagvin Skray's done some work on the Avaldsnes, and I'm not necessarily sold on the idea that there was these sea kings in Avaldsnes, but you do see ripples of power and how that affects. And so then I do think that within Scandinavia, within Western Norway, these pirates were being pushed out. And so they went to then 793 Lindisfarne and then Ireland. And so I think it's all politics. And as you kind of follow this narrative, using the map and watching all of Europe and not just England and not just Ireland and not just Frankia, as you watch it all happen, you can kind of see that perhaps the Great Army should be renamed, and I do, within my thesis, I do rename it the Channel Army, because it's not all about England. It's happening as well in Frankia, and there's settlements in Normandy and Brittany as well. And I think that has to do with the collapse of the Danish kingdom in the 850s, and a power vacuum forms and pushes out leaders who are then looking out to carve individual territories, and they've managed to do that within Northumbria and East Anglia and in Normandy and Brittany. So I think it's all politics.
You know, that's fascinating. It's all politics, and the ripples of power is a line I'm definitely going to steal and obviously quote you on that. But I think that's really interesting. I think there's two aspects to that: what's happening sort of in the Baltic and to the east, and what's happening to the west. But from my perspective, this idea of the Channel Army and you know, sort of Christian humans work on the Vikings in the Low Countries and Frankia as well is really interesting. That people now are beginning to see, you know, this is the kind of, you know, as I say, from 850s again in my research, 850s when things really start to change and take on a new flavor. So this is something I'll be really fascinated to read in your research that will be coming out over the next few years. And looking then at, you know, this sort of locus of activity between the Danish territories, which of course go up into sort of southern Norway and southern Sweden. What is kind of happening then is there's a major change around about the 850s in that sort of coastal band between Denmark and Normandy and Brittany. And my work is kind of sort of saying, yeah, these are the groups that then seem to be active. Then they go over to Ireland, or they sort of disrupt. They're disruptors, to use a sort of modern sense there. And then again, it seems to be these same groups that then say, okay, we've done this in Ireland. You know, these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms look fairly ripe for the plucking. So what's your opinion then of what that critical period between sort of like 850 and 900, and we'll say in the West first, or particularly between 850 and in the early 870s?
What's my take on it?
Yeah.
I'll work. So I must admit, I do very little in Eastern Europe. So I do an area that I call Atlantic Europe, which is anything that kind of touches the Atlantic and North Sea. And then kind of I do look at the silver that arrives in the Baltic, but not specializing in it. But yeah, so 850s, I mean, as I said before, I think there is evidence in the historical in the Frankish annals that the Danish kingdom collapses during the Civil War. And you see Danes who were granted Frankish lands under the Frankish kings, they try to go back into Denmark to reclaim kingship, or so they're clearly royals or nobility, and then they get driven out again. And similarly, in the 860s, you have the arrival of these kings or leaders, and as I said, the Great Army, which is I think the Channel Army, going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between England and Frankia. But I think I have to say, and this is highly controversial, and I know that I'm going to get into a lot of trouble, but I think that the Ivar connection in the 850s to about 900, I think the Ivar connection between Ireland and England in this 50-year period, wishful thinking, complete fabrication. Don't believe in it. I think it's silly. I'm sorry. People are going to come for me. I know they are.
And this ends the podcast.
Exactly. Yeah. So, because I have to say, Tom, you are cited in my research, and I know that you are a big Iverson person. And I'm not saying the Iverson connection didn't exist. I just don't think it existed in this period.
Yeah.
I think it was later. Because when you're looking at, like I said, when you're looking at this kind of weird entire bird's eye overview, what's happening in Ireland is so different. And when I say Ireland, I do mean the Irish Sea region. So kind of Scotland and Morecambe Bay and the Isle of Man. And then, so I think that people in the podcast won't see, but I am moving my hands a lot to map in my head. You have the Irish Sea area, and then you have the Channel area. And I think that these are two different groups. And I think the Channel area, I'm not going to call them Norwegians versus Danes, but regionally, I think the Channel area is from primarily the Jutland Peninsula, the Danish area, and probably the Oslo Fjord. And then I think people who ended up in the Irish Sea were likely come down from the west coast of Norway. And so, and you have settlements in Ireland from the 830s onwards, which is a generation before any type of settlement that you get in England and Frankia. And I think that's significant because this kind of colony, the satellite colony in Ireland and the Irish Sea, is kind of further progressed. It's a generation ahead, and they have their own cities. Dublin is a city state by the 870s, 880s, 890s. So yeah, that's my take on it. And you see that too with this. I guess the problem is my PhD is so visual that like it's hard to describe on a podcast because I want to be like, yeah, look, you can see the durance, and but you can't not on a podcast.
Absolutely fascinating. I think the interesting thing is, regardless of my conclusions and your conclusions, that people are really starting to interrogate the differences and the similarities and the connections, or the non-connections between these channel groups that you talk about, and what's happening in Ireland and what's happening in England, and generational differences as well. I think that's something that people are beginning to sort of investigate. And I know recently, as the conference in the Netherlands, Jane Kershaw and Stephen Merkel's project about silver stocks, and we're now beginning to literally, well, sometimes it's laser ablation, but drill down into the silver and finding out that there are stocks that are basically connected to one area. So one might be, I say, a North Sea stock, and one might be an Irish Sea stock. And I think, so that it's an exciting time that, I mean, we'll both be, we're in that unfortunate period where we're on the cusp of these great new discoveries. So whatever we write now in 5 years or even 2 years will probably be it could be out of date, or it could be proved. But I think it's really an exciting time that, we're all beginning to really start to drill down. Because I think, as you're saying, for a long period, things have kind of drifted into very sort of regional studies. So I think your research is very exciting because it's something that I did, far less sophisticatedly, if that's the word, but trying to just sort of step back. And you take a big risk, I think, then, as particularly in the Viking world, because it has become so regionalized in many areas, to take that wide view of things means you're open to criticism from all the different regional researchers and all the different specific groups of research types. So you're dealing with silver, you're dealing with fabrics and textiles. And how have you found that then? Because, I mean, your research is truly interdisciplinary, and I'm glad I managed to say that. But you can look at a lot of textual evidence and a lot of material culture evidence. So that's just the stuff, the artifacts. How have you found that as a researcher to deal with, and what sort of conflicts have you had? Have you had lots of sources saying A, but the material culture, the archaeological evidence is saying B? I mean, what sort of conflicts, or what areas where you thought, oh, surprised you, and you thought, well, okay, I've assumed this from reading the history, or I've assumed this from understanding the archaeology, and then the other side is saying something quite different? Where are the sort of interesting tensions in finding out what's happening in this sort of 850s plus period in the Viking world?
Yeah, I guess to start, I would like to say this is where my mind went. So I am very fortunate in that I am still technically a PhD at the Trinity Center for Environmental Humanities. Even though I'm studying a medieval project, I did not go into the Center for Medieval Studies at Trinity, and I went into this interdisciplinary, more digitally embracing group of researchers, and they have been so inspiring, and I just feel very lucky to have worked alongside that team. And that did mean, though, that I was open to criticism from the Medieval Center at Trinity, and there were some professors who were not that excited about my research, and just thought that I had gone too broad and that I was in danger of not specializing in anything, that I wasn't going to be able to get a handle on the vast data that I was using. And what I will be the first to say, I am not a specialist. I'm not a numismatist. I am not a burial expert. I can passably read Latin, but not at all. And this is the problem with the sources as a Viking historian as well, if you're a Viking historian, is that the Frankish annals are written in Latin, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is written in Old English, and the Irish sources are in a mix of Latin and Middle Irish. And so if you're a Viking historian, that really does pigeonhole you because you are expected to be able to read all of them. And I worked mostly with English translation. So that was a big criticism, was that I wasn't doing close readings. I was reading translations. I wasn't using the original copies. But my argument is I was not trying to do a close reading. I was trying to distill this data into points, essentially. And so I used very vague, a three activity system, where I looked if the events that were described were diplomatic, whether they were conflict, whether that be violent, whether that be murder, whether that be a battle or a raid, just kept it under conflict, and then a settlement. And so that covered a broad range of things. So like I said, if like 843, they attack Paris, I just added the geocoordinates of Paris. I mapped it as a conflict, and I moved on from there. I was not interested in the hows, whens, or whys that happened, because I did look at this kind of overview. And that has received some criticism, and it has received pushback. And I have had people be like, well, you can't study these coins, or you can't study these periods without having like a thorough understanding. And it's like, well, I argue, like, I'm studying a period. I'm a generalist, but I'm also doing this big digital humanities project, and I am trying to accumulate big data so I can get big answers, as opposed to being, combing through with a fine-tooth comb.
Right, I think that's what the field needs, because I felt that as well. Yeah, I like you, I could have said word for word about not being a numismatist, not being a burials expert. But occasionally, I think every generation needs a few people. Not that we're heroes, but we need a few people to sort of, to stand up and be sort of shot at and say, okay, we've now got so into the detail that we can't see the wood for the trees. And I mean, I think the way, now, interesting your take on it. I think if I have 10 ideas and one of them leads to some sort of breakthrough or helps researchers say, oh, that explains why Viking Group A is doing this and not what I expected them to do. And then that can just open up their research, which may be just on a tighter group of evidence, it's just burials or numismatics. And yeah, so I mean, I think that's what we're both trying to do, and we will get criticism for that. But I'm interested, from your research. Then I've read online that you think then you've got something called a two-group theory, so which might help, again, lots of researchers like myself and other researchers maybe sort of it begin to maybe help join the dots, something that hadn't made sense before. You've got this theory, so I think if you can explain what you want to explain about it now, but in advance of your any publications, but just tell us about this. And I love the name of it, the two-group theory. So Tenaya, what is that?
Well, it's what I've already explained. It's the politics. It's the about 790 to 850. It's kind of the Danes and their relationships with the Franks, and they actually don't have a lot to do with England at the time. So it's their kind of aggravations with the Franks, and then you have the Western Norwegians who are setting up shop in Ireland, in the Irish Sea. And then that does transform in 850 following the collapse of the Danish kingdom, where you have the Channel Army, and at which point the Western Norwegians have settled enough in Ireland that you don't have a lot of ships going back and forth anymore. You have, in the early 30s, 40s, 50s, you do have a lot of notes in the Irish Channel saying more ships arrived, more ships arrived, more ships arrived. But you start to see that die out after the arrival of Olaf, Ivar, and the third brother, cousin king, Oisel. And so at that point, you have the Hiberno Norse. So my two group theory is roughly 800 to 850. I call them the Viking Norse, Irish Sea, and then the Dano Norse. And then following 850, 860, the Viking Norse become the Hiberno Norse, and the Dano Norse become the Channel Island. So it's these strands, and you can see regionally how they stay the same, but they evolve.
And after that point, then this later, you were discussing my research later, which again, I'm more interested in that last quarter of the 9th century. What then is happening in England and southern Scotland now? One thing is about, what do we call this, if we're not calling it the Great Army? So, my question is then, what's happening in the 860s, 870s and the sort of generation afterwards, as far as you can see in your research in the island of Britain, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, you also, it's also, when I'm talking about not being a specialist, is like when you're understanding the Vikings in these regions, you also have to get a really good grip of the politics of the situation that they're in. And so I had to learn a lot about the Carolingians, and I had to learn a lot about the early English kingdoms. And so Ben Raffield had a really great paper when he was talking about Band of Brothers. I think it was called Band of Brothers.
I nearly mentioned that earlier as soon as you were saying about whether the brothers or cousins or allies, and I thought Ben Raffield's paper is perfect for that.
Yeah, exactly. And but what he talks about is how it's not this great empire. Chris Kooijman also has talked about a hierarchy, and it's these groups that come together, but ultimately they're seeking to carve out their own individual tracts of land. They are these leaders, and that's why I think definitely they are kind of exiles from the Danish kingdom, because they are probably royalty, they're probably nobility. They've lost their lands because they backed the wrong person. So and this is of course all speculation, but in understanding the ripples of power, I do think that you have these people come out and they're like, okay, we can't stay in our homeland anymore. So I was about to swear, but
well, it gives us a chance. Luke's got a big red bleep button, so he could have just pressed that. It's fine, don't worry about it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So but I think that they basically just I think that they start carving out their own individual tracts of lands, and that's why you have the kingdom in Northumbria, who Guthrum does not have anything to do with. Guthrum's in East Anglia. We don't know who the leader in Northumbria is at the time. He's not named. You have Northumbria, you have East Anglia. As I said before, you have Normandy. You likely have places in and Normandy, by the way, was settled long before Rollo. He's just the first one who's really named and signs a treaty, but you definitely have settlements in Normandy before that. And then so I think that that's what's happening. And so then by 900 you have territories that are marked out, but then you also have these hierarchy, these armies that are still kind of on. They continue for a generation or more. I think they kind of become used to this kind of peripatetic lifestyle.
As an archaeologist, I actually started off as a historian. It's my dark secret. Studying Gregory of Tours and Avitus of Vienne and whatnot. How did you find the sources? And I think, just for listeners, what was the most interesting source, or what were the kind of sources that you thought actually were most accurate when you sort of looked at them after looking at everything? Thought, the compilers of this annal or this history, really actually had their finger on the pulse. They saw the sort of bigger patterns, or what these Vikings were maybe sort of trying to do regionally or anything like that. So I'm really was just asking about some nice nuggets of either particular annals or particular historians that you've read that helped enlighten you and made you think, actually, they're writing this in the 9th century, but their analytical skills of the bigger picture is really impressive.
Oh, I'm gonna disappoint you.
No.
It's dead boring. It's it's terrible. No, it's not. There's nothing fun about the Annals and the Chronicles. I guess, you said that you started out as a historian. I did my bachelor's degree in English literature, and I actually read the Icelandic sagas. And you asked before, like, what really got me into it. I think I went to see the Viking Ship Museum because I had read the Icelandic sagas, and I was like, well, that'd be cool. And I loved Laxdæla saga, of course, because I'm a hopeless romantic. And the All Saga, and so I was like, oh cool, there's going to be a story here. But I think that's almost part of the reason that I kind of put all the sources together, because one source doesn't tell a story. I think there's a scholar who refers to the Irish annals as fragmented and without a cohesive narrative. That might be a direct quote. And it's the same with the Frankish sources, which are much more concerned with anything not quote unquote Viking or Danish. They'll refer to oh, we had the Danish ambassadors down and they said that they didn't murder this person. But that's just a sentence and a block of things about their relationships with the Arabic pirates or the Arabic empires, the Spanish, the Britons, Brittany, the English marrying different courtiers. There is no cohesive narrative. So I found that all very, very dull. I found it very dull, but worth it. And I think that's moral of the story, right? Is sometimes you just got to push through it because there are nuggets of gold.
I think that's a really interesting point. For the first time a few months ago, I decided to read the Annals of Ulster for 3 centuries worth, because we're always like it. Especially as archaeologists, we're very guilty. We'll just quote something we've kind of Googled and it'll say Annals of Ulster, and you'll just view that 1 year in isolation. So, I do a lot of work with the Govan Stone, so the Kingdom of Strathclyde, which starts because, well, from what we know is from the Annals of Ulster, when they talk about the Dublin Vikings coming in and taking Outclut, the sort of citadel and Dumbarton Rock. I just quoted that for years, and that's hadn't looked before or afterwards. And when I sat there, you can tell my Friday nights are fun, but when you look at it as you're saying, as a whole, and then you start to see those patterns, so you would see nothing's happening again from a Vikingist point of view, and then suddenly it will be like a little murmur, be I can't remember what they call them, heathens or Northmen or whatever it is, and suddenly you'll see one little blip, and then the next year there'll be another, and then suddenly every year from the late 8th century until the mid 12th, it's Scandinavians, and they're murdering each other and they're being murdered, and then you see their names slightly changing, but they're still. And I suppose that's what you're saying is you have to sort of step back. Historians will probably hate this part of the podcast, but as archaeologists, we need firstly to read the sources, because we're too guilty, I think, a lot of the time of not. But then you're saying you stood back and as an amalgam, when you put them together, then you start to draw out patterns. And is that then something? Then once what did you do? Did you look at the historical evidence first? There's a lot of tension between history and archaeology, between which one's the quote unquote handmaiden, to use some outdated language. What was your methodology in that sense? Did you look at these historical sources and then say, okay, these are some patterns, and then, as it were, tested it with archaeological evidence? Or did you come from the archaeology side and saw, okay, this is what I'm told the patterns are, and this is what I can assess from my own overview? What was your way into sort of getting the archaeology and the history kind of to talk to each other, and what sort of archaeological sources did you find sort of most enlightening?
Yeah, I mean, now we're going to talk methodology, so people might take a nap during this part.
Just take a cup of tea or something like that. Come back in about 5 minutes, fine.
But I knew from the beginning that I wanted an interdisciplinary project, and like I said, because of the Center for Environmental Humanities Center that I was in, very much encouraged that. So I knew that I was going to take the sources, and I knew the contemporary sources, and I knew that I was going to take the archaeological material and I was going to compare them. But that meant that I had to do kind of tests on each of them to like make sure that I could use them, because you can't you can't just say like, oh, well, these were written in the 9th century because and that means that they're accurate, right? Like that's like saying like, oh, Donald Trump tweeted about it, so that must be right. I always
that's what an annal is. It's kind of like one sentence, isn't it? And then you've got to decide an entire kingdom based on. So if someone was trying to tell our history of our century from a tweet, and that's essentially what we're trying to do, really, isn't it? With the annals in particular,
Yeah, exactly. So so the first chapter of my thesis, is actually like a whole lit review where I go through what every nation has to say about the Vikings, and why, and then saying like, this is why we can't do national studies. This is why we have to do a broad scope, because we're losing a lot of information by doing the Vikings in England or the Vikings in Ireland. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, I do go through and I do these tests on the annals and the chronicles. So I'll do a 20 or 40-year period of mapping, say, the annals of Ulster, not just the Vikings, but I will map every single event that happened over the course of 20 years. And then I can kind of see, and that means that like when I'm actually mapping them, I'm not, if it's too broad, if they say like, oh, there was an attack in Munster, or there was a two kings fought in Ulster, like I don't actually map that because it's not specific. So I'm only mapping very specific things. And that means that when you end up throwing that all up on a map, you're kind of seeing a cluster around likely where it was written. And as it kind of spreads, it starts to thin out. And then you can kind of see that there's like nothing really for like the West or the South. So, and then I was also doing statistical analysis on those, and which was separate from the coordinates, and looking at the different types of conflict or the diplomacy, or whether it had to do with the church. So those were my tests to kind of see, can we trust the geography, like the provenance of what they're talking about, and can we trust them to record different types of events. And it was really interesting to see, like, Annals of Ulster definitely is northeast, and same with the Annals of Innisfallen. When you're looking at like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it's very much Wessex based, which would be southwestern England. There's like one or two mentions in the north, but like generally speaking, like you're missing huge gaps of what's going on in England, and definitely Scotland. The same with the Frankish annals, the Royal Frankish annals, which were written during Charlemagne and Louis XIV. Louis the Pious. That's much more comprehensive, a huge geographical spread. But when that breaks off into the annals of Saint Bertrand and the annals of Fulda, those break apart into East and West. And so, so that was my methodology with the annals and the chronicles, was to make sure I knew to what extent I could trust them. Because as I said before, like you can't just take it as like it would be historically incorrect just to be like, oh, well, the annals of Ulster said that, so it's got to be true. And then with the with the archaeological material, I had to, that took time. I really struggled with which types of evidence I was going to use, and I settled on a silver hoards inclusive of coins. And what I ended up doing is I tried to map the mines, starting with the origin of the silver. This was part of my methodology, my test. but there was only one large silver mine in Mel in France at the time, and the rest of the mines seem to have come from the east. And so then it was like, okay, well, now I'm going to map all the mints for the different periods. And that was, oh my God, it was so exhausting. And so then I mapped all the Frankish mints over the course of Charlemagne to up until the collapse of the Frankish Empire. Same with, like, there were like 4 or 5 mints in England up until Athelstan, at which point there were, and this is the thing too, is like some mints would, oh my God, sorry, necessarily marked out where they were mint, like coin was not marked out where it was minted in England, especially. So you didn't know if it was coming from London or if it was coming from York until Athelstan in 924. And then, of course, Ireland has no mints. And so then I looked at the hoards, and I specifically took the Carolingian hoards as collected by Simon Copeland, and I mapped Durham hoards, which were collected by Christoph Kilger in 2007, and also, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, the Polish Jano. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, Yankovic. Yeah, I do. Yeah, we can probably badly dub this in later when we're both when we can remember. But yeah, I know. Yeah, I mean, what Tenaya is talking about there is that, you know, the same people that I was using in my research as well, and now this new research. I mean, Simon was at the conference with Jane and Kershaw and Stephen Merkel, and there's so much work being done now. So, you know, even the work that, you know, Tenaya and I've been looking at in the past, there's so much coming out in that in the near future. But there's enough there now, as Tenaya is saying, that, you know, we can begin to sort of build a picture of, because you're looking at this wider thing of directions and sources. So yeah, so I you know, looking at, you know, are there any specific hoards that were interested, or a collection or a regional grouping of hoards that kind of you know, enlightened you in any particular, where you when you started to see, you know, that's a pattern emerging here?
Yes. So I think one thing that we don't necessarily look at is that there were 2 mints in Denmark, one at Hedeby and one at Ribe. And that's really, really, really important when you're looking at silver hoards in Denmark and up into Norway into 920, not after, but 920. And you're going to see that there's actually not that many hoards that make it over, not that Durham hoard specifically. And so, and even Carolingian as well. And where you see is you have the Durhams that are in Gotland, and then they end up in the Irish Sea area, as well as what Tom, you call the Quairdale corridor between York and Dublin. But there's not really there's not that many that end up in York even, or any that end up in kind of the Norse-held territories in Frankia. And also at the same time, I have what I termed the silver curtain, and there's going to be a paper on this that's forthcoming. But the Durham hoards don't make it past this area in central Germany right beneath Jutland, and there's this gap that is what I call the silver curtain, or the Durham hoards don't pass west, and the Carolingian hoards don't pass east. There's just a gap. And what I take that,
just point out here to the listeners that dirhams are silver coins that are coming from mints like Baghdad and the Caliphate, but is also places like Uzbekistan as well. So that's one of the major silver sources, as Tenaya is just explaining at the moment, sort of in sort of Eastern Europe and Baltic Europe. But sorry, go on. It was, yeah, just to, because you and I both love these little coins, but just in case anyone didn't, I can't imagine anyone not. But so yeah, sorry, with this gap, this curtain. So what you think is happening here then?
Well, I think when you're looking at the, like, and this is where mapping the mints came into view, is I think that there was a currency definitely within Frankia that was so strong that any dirhams that came into Frankia were stopped at the border, melted down, and redistributed into Frankish mints. But I think that also came into play within Denmark as well, where they weren't necessarily, I'm not saying it was a coin currency, but I think definitely ingot. And then there's these like arm rings that they used as currency as well, but I forget what they're called off the top of my head. But they've been very well studied by John Sheehan. And
the broad band arm rings, or
no, they're I forget what they're called. They're not broadband arm rings.
Or the spiral.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think that what happened is when these dirhams start coming over into Jutland and into the Oslo Fjord, I do think that they're melted down and they're turned into these ingots or the arm rings, which are used as a form of currency. Because why would you have dirhams in Gotland and you'd have dirhams in the Irish Sea region, but you wouldn't have any in between? And by any, I mean, yes, there's one or two, but there's not a large collection of hoards throughout.
And so this is yeah, going back to your Christoph Kilger, and he makes very interesting points. You know, again, we might talk very briefly about the Baltic later, and the Gotland is very central to that, because if you're talking about, you know, these silver coins, these dirhams coming in through the sort of Ukrainian, Russian river systems from Central Asia and what is now Iraq, he is seeing them as early adopters. They go east very early, and this is again when the Viking Age doesn't start in Northumberland. It probably starts in the mid 8th century, if not earlier, in the Baltic, when people are possibly looking for ways to get even more of the silver. And the Gotlanders, which is an island just off the coast of Sweden, that has coin hoards in there, dirham hoards that have 10, 14,000 dirhams in them. But you know, going back on your point and your research into Christoph Kilger, he's talking about, again, these really early links that appear to be quite direct between Gotland and the east coast of Ireland. So again, but again, at that time in between, they're not being there. So I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think probably use this as an excuse now to talk about maybe the Gotlanders, and the fact that you're talking about Ben Raffield's work about these small groups and these, of people. So what, just elaborate a little bit more about, what you're just saying there about the Gotlanders and the dirhams going to Ireland and maybe directly from Gotland.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it all has to do with power and the centralization of power. And this is like, I don't talk a lot about like power structures. I'm not really into kings. I'm not talking about, kings or queens, genders, or anything like that. I'm just particularly interested in how I believe that within Denmark and the Oslo Fjord region, that the power was strong enough that when the dirhams arrived, and they must have come through, the Baltic into the North Sea, when the dirhams arrived, they would have been melted down and not been held as dirhams. And the dirhams that do survive as individual are often used as jewelry. They're not used as currency, and we know that. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Tom.
No. I mean, yeah. I mean, when we're talking about dirhams in the Baltic, it's especially if Gotland, they've got so many there that it appears to be massive inflation. So even the dirhams there that are coins, they don't probably appear to maybe use them as coins so much, because I think within Gotland, a dirham had basically no worth, and you could have 10,000 of them and it had no worth. So very odd things are happening there. And this is again what, in future with the various these ablations. So basically you're testing these ingots, and basically when Tenaya was talking earlier about ingots and arm rings, you basically get your little sort of piece of silver that's in an ingot. You just create a little channel in, say, something like a soapstone, a talc stone, and you pour the silver in, and you can then use that as in a what they call bullion economy. So it's the weight and the quality of silver that becomes like your cash, but they can also be beaten out into these arm rings that Tenaya was talking about earlier. But then what you'll find is then they're cut up and they're used as this what's known as hack silver. So everything becomes very mixed. And as I think Tenaya is alluding to there, it's the value and the weight of the silver. So we'll be talking about dirhams, but and it's sometimes a nice thing to have, and hence why they're associated with trade, and I think long distance movement, which is something highly prestigious in the Scandinavian world. But it doesn't really matter if you're getting, as laterally happens, the good silver is coming, from English mints and German mints. You go to that. You just go with where the good silver is coming from. So yeah, certainly with me, you shouldn't get too caught up about the dirhams. But yeah, sorry, can continue on. But yeah, the actual form of the silver is it doesn't really matter to them.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. I think that I think especially when it gets to the Carolingians, they have their own economy, so they're not going to be using dirhams. They're going to melt that. Yeah, I was going to swear. I was going to say they're going to melt that shit down. Yeah, they're gonna melt it down. They're gonna turn it into their own Carolingian-based coins. And I think, so that's what I was doing. Like I know you love your dirhams. I know you love them in their pure dirham form, but I'm much more interested in why the dirhams aren't there in Denmark, why they're not there in England as hoards, because you do find them as hoards in the east coast of Ireland, and even then, not really in Dublin, but within 20 kilometers. So it's likely that they were given as payment to the Irish, who then buried them on the borders. That's one of the theories. So yeah, so that's my theory about coins. I can also talk very quickly about graves if you'd like.
I think everyone would really like that. I mean, yeah, I mean, Viking burials are, you can have an entire career entirely just looking at Viking burials in one particular town. So I'm really interested on Tanaya's take on, because you've looked at them in this wider project, because we'll often, all of us, just read these smaller, very important regional studies. But yeah, I think it would be really good for us to listen to how you view it, having had that sort of that wider view.
Well, I think the graves more than anything really solidified this two group theory in my head, because when you one of my favorite things to do when you're looking at a map is we're so well we're just attuned to this idea of north to south, east to west, but that's a very kind of 20th 21st century, even a little bit earlier than that even, but it's definitely not a 10th or a 9th century thing. So one of my favorite things to do is to turn a map. So that would be like when I would put myself at Bergen, but then I would put kind of Bergen on the west coast of Norway, but then I would just turn the map, this idea that like where I'm setting out is right in front of me. So that would mean that west was in the northern position. And so when you do that, you do see this very natural progression of how from Bergen on the west coast of Norway, you set out, you hit Shetland, then you turn and you drop down into Orkney. And from there, you're going to see land going down the west coast of Scotland and into the Irish Sea.
And importantly, in the top, I should just point out to, again, it's a time to get your maps out, but maybe we'll try and put a map out now so you can see. But interestingly, the basically the top left-hand corner of mainland Scotland is called Cape Wrath, and Wrath means turning point. So yeah, go on. So yeah, that's just to your point. Yeah. So yeah, so you look at it in a new way.
Yeah, and so I mean, I don't think that's necessarily a brand new way, but it's but when I was doing the distribution of the graves, that's where the Viking graves are. They're in Shetland, they're in Orkney, they're in the west coast of Scotland, they're in the island, the Scottish Isles, and they're in Ireland. They are not in the Danelaw on the east coast of England, and they are not in Frankia. So that for me was very much like these are two separate groups. And then also when you map, and I sent this map to you, I think when you were working on your book, Tom, but when you map the dirhams against the burials, you end up getting these, the dirhams kind of line up with the burials, but they don't line up with the non-burials, or their absence lines up with the absence of the burials as well.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very interesting. So that for me is like, okay, we have two different Viking groups going on here. So, and then I owe Jane Kershaw maybe my career, but she did this amazing study where she started looking at female jewelry, the brooches, the oval brooches, which are very, if you saw them, they look like tortoise backs, and women would wear two of them, one on each shoulder. And so Jane Kershaw had done this study where she collected all of them, and they're available basically through the Portable Antiquities Scheme online database. And so I mapped them up until 2021. And basically what you find is they do exist within the Danelaw, south of the Humber. They do not extend up into Northumbria, which is part of England. They don't extend west into Lancashire, which is on the Irish Sea. So these places that we know were, you know, Viking strongholds, quote unquote Viking, these areas that had active burials didn't have the brooches, and the places that had the brooches didn't have the burials. So you're having different burial patterns with these, again, what I believe are two different groups.
I mean, and that's interesting as well. I mean, you and I think originally met digging at Repton, but Derbyshire is a very interesting place if you're talking about different burial customs, because there's a new site at Foremark, which is slightly further up the River Trent, but Repton is where they're being the inhumation, the classic Viking burials with your sword and your spear, you know, buried next to your brother, your son. Absolutely, if you think of a Viking burial, you're thinking of something like Repton. But you know, a couple miles down the Trent, they've got Heathwood, which is a cremation cemetery. And interestingly, after, you know, they're staying there at what we call these overwintering camps or winter camps. And there's potentially now an idea that maybe one group, because they split up the year after, once they end using this after they finish overwintering in 873, 874, maybe the split has already happened, because maybe one group with different traditions, again, going back to the Ben Raphael and the different groups that are temporarily put together, is at Repton, and the other group is at this other site at Foremark. And Foremark, this other site we've been discovering with Kat Jarman et al., slightly further up, but it's near Heathwood, near this cremation burial as well. So is that kind of what you're saying? You're sort of seeing different groups in the sort of burial rites?
Yeah, I mean, I do find that Repton and Foremark and Heathwood, I do think that those are kind of more active military burial sites, because you're seeing the mass burials, and I am talking more about the long-term settlement. So I think that the individuals or the double burials that we're seeing in Scotland and the brooches that we're discovering, I think that that's much more indicative of long-term settlement. I don't think they have anything to do with the overwintering. But the idea that, yes, there were cremations in Heathwood and then there were burials at Repton, I absolutely do think that that is significant of two separate groups that are active together at the same time. The hierarchies, as Chris would say.
And you know, that's, you know, so we're coming, you know, near to the end of our podcast. I mean, I could talk for another hour, but I think ace producer Luke might have something to say about that. And I suppose it's just, you know, you asked me, and I thought it was a really nice ending to the podcast that I did with the Shindig, is, you know, what then is, you know, it could be a Viking dig, it might not be, but what has been your best archaeological experience? It might be Viking, as I say, it might not be, and or you know, even your greatest find, or something that you've found textually, or in just in your research of archaeology more generally. What is the thing, you know, when I'm asking this question, what's the first thing kind of, you know, springs to mind?
I have to say, my first dig was at Lancaster Castle in the summer of 2016, and I got invited by my cousin, and it was my first dig, and I was so excited as a volunteer. And I found a post hole. It was Roman, late Roman, and we found evidence for a third phase of building of a cavalry camp. And it was just, I found a couple of Roman coins. It was a sunny weather. It was really warm. It was gorgeous. We had a couple of Syrian refugees working with us. It was the summer of the Brexit vote. Maybe you'll cut this out, Tom, but everyone was fiercely against Brexit, and it was just the talk of everything. And I got to do it with my best friend, and it was just such a lovely experience, and it just made me feel like archaeology was the right career for me.
And I'll just, you know, I mean, you know, it's far too modest, but this wasn't the first or last, or it was the first post hole that you found, because I believe you found one at Repton as well. Could you maybe just have any memories of digging at Repton, which is one of the greatest Viking sites, certainly in the west of Europe?
Yeah, no, it's a huge honor to say that I got to dig at Repton, absolutely, because it's so famous. And so, you know, you get to do a little hair flip and you're like, yeah, I dug it Repton. But Tom and I were put onto a team, and I'm gonna hold this over Tom's head for ages, but we were putting a slot in, and I was like, "Oh, I think that's a post hole," and Tom's like, "No, doesn't look like it."
It's not a shiny silver coin. I'm not that interested. Can we move on?
But yeah, so then we took it down very slowly because I was like, I'm pretty sure that's a post hole or something. I was pretty sure it was something. But we took it down slowly, kind of centimeter by centimeter, and then it was pretty clear that it was a post hole. And I think it was the first one that was found since the 80s on site.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And then Tom did find a second one. So Tom gets credit for that.
Yeah. No, it's one of those things. On archaeological sites, someone will find something cool, and everybody is kind of really concentrating on finding that thing.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't have seen it without Tenaya looking at it. But it's been. I think that's given maybe everyone a little insight into the fact that Tenaya and I still get this sort of childlike wonder at being able to dig in these sites that have been. Anyone who's famous in the Viking world has been able to go to them, and then we get invited, and it's an absolute joy, and it was an absolute joy talking to you today, Tenaya. And just quickly before we go, what your plans next? You've got your Viva coming up, and then I know you're interested still in doing lots more sort of data visualization. Just to finish, just to tell us your plans for the sort of next year or two.
Well, I don't know if anyone is listening and wants to give me a job. I am no.
You have a website which is Tenaya Jorgensen, Jorgensen.com, but we'll put that out.
Yeah, no, I love data. I love working with the Vikings and interdisciplinary. So I'm kind of hoping to stay within digital competencies if I move into the private sector. But of course, I'd love to stay within academia. It's difficult, as I think we all know.
And that's fine. But I think your contribution, I mean, the fact that you've got, an open access website already is just, because sometimes it can take years to get a paper out or a book out, as we both know, they're hugely lengthy processes. And sometimes they're not always open access, or very often they're not, which is fine. But at the same point, the fact is that you're immediately, whilst working on it, giving your research out is just absolutely fantastic. So we'll give everyone the links, and we'll share all your papers when they come out in future, and reflog this podcast because I've been talking for quite a while. But yeah, so I just want to say thank you so much from Luke and I, and well, best of luck with the Viva. I'm sure it'll be absolutely no problem. And yeah, thank you so much for spending your day with us today, Tenaya.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to talk to you guys.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as we did. I mean,
I don't think anyone could enjoy that as much as you did.
I don't think. But please do write in if you did, if it's all possible. I think it's fascinating. As I say, you were saying in the introduction, the fact that it's open access. You can go to this website now and have a look. You can look at all the data that Tenaya has analysed as part of that within this map. And it's just something that doesn't happen all that often in archaeology. But Tenaya's just got this amazing overview of the Viking world, really, particularly in the West. And we still don't really know what's happening exactly when. And there's a real sort of, confusion's the wrong word, but we've still got so much to learn about what's happening in southern Scandinavia, so sort of southern Norway, southern Sweden, and what we now think of as Denmark, and into Frisia, the Low Countries, and in the north of what is now France. And I think Tenaya's got some really, really brilliant ideas about what is happening in that part of the Viking world. And from my perspective and my research, I think if you understand that part of the Viking world, you can understand the whole picture.
Yeah, it was an amazing podcast. I was actually really interested in that. She studied English literature and how that kind of came over to this. I only thought about it afterwards. I wanted to ask her a question on how she feels that the Vikings may have affected storytelling in, say, England and Ireland and that kind of a thing. Because I know from my own previous life as an actor that the play Hamlet by Shakespeare is based on Norse saga, as far as I know, with Hamlet.
Danish,
Uh,
Danish princelings. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
as far as I know as well. But yeah, that's what Tenaya was saying when she's talking about, she into the sagas, and she was into the sort of the sort of the originally into the sort of the romance and just the cracking stories that used to tell. But yeah, a lot of the best sagas are of connected to the Irish world, and that's obviously had a big influence on what's happening in Iceland when they're actually composing these.
Yeah, it's all fascinating. It's amazing. It was a great podcast. Hopefully, our listeners, our viewers enjoyed it. And if you did enjoy it and you enjoyed hearing Tenaya, go back and listen to our classic episodes, which all heavily feature Tenaya, including an interview that's in reverse, where Tenaya interviews Tom here about Vikings. So if you enjoyed it, you'll definitely enjoy that. So make sure to hit subscribe, hit follow us on all of our social medias. And if you're an archaeologist watching this and you think you've an interesting story to tell, maybe hit us up, leave us a comment, send us a tweet, contact us on Facebook, wherever you're watching this. Let us know that you'd like to be on the Shindig.
And it's goodbye for me, and thank you for listening.